Thank you for attending The Future Has Changed, So How Do We Thrive? Presented by the Corporate Development Society at TAG today. First of all, I want to just thank our society sponsor, Cherry Beckhart, for your annual sponsorship for the society. We couldn't do these events without you. Second, and I would like to introduce Christy Brown, who is CEO of Launchpad 2X, and she will be our moderator today, and she's also on the board for our Corporate Development Society, and she will go ahead and introduce our panel and start our discussion. Thanks, Christy.
Yeah, you got it. Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning to everyone joining. Super excited to have you. We have promoted and accelerated many of these virtual panels, and they've been great successes for us to learn and discuss topics of relevance that are going on in today's world. So as Rebecca mentioned, I'm Christy Brown, president of Launchpad 2X, headquartered here in Atlanta. Launchpad 2X, for those who are unfamiliar, is an accelerator for female founders. We promote founders into CEOs with targets of $20 million companies that we know that they can become. So I'm super happy to have all of you join us for a very, very interesting conversation on the future has changed, so how do we thrive? Our target today is really to host this conversation as we begin thinking about reentry strategies, but moreover, how companies are actually emerging during this healthcare crisis that has defined us for more than 3 or 4 months at this point. So really eager to get started. We have a great panel of 4 amazing guests that you will find very relevant in discussion. So they are heavily selected across varying industries to provide their overviews of their companies, the economy, even some innovative growth strategies. So I've asked each of them actually to provide about a 1-minute overview. So I'll get started and make the introductions. Tom Cunningham, why don't we start with you and provide an introduction of who you are and what your expertise is.
Hi, and thank you for that introduction. I'm Tom Cunningham. I'm the chief economist at the Metro Atlanta Chamber. I'm an economist by training, obviously. I spent my first 30 years of my career at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta doing monetary policy, open economy, macroeconomics, and regional analysis. I retired and got drafted by the Metro Atlanta Chamber to do regional analysis and policy work for the Chamber to promote the well-being of the metro area.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. Samyr, why don't we start with you?
Sure thing. I'm Samyr Qureshi, co-founder and CEO of Knack. We are an education technology platform working with colleges and universities across the country. Campuses like the University of Florida or Johns Hopkins University partner with us to launch and scale peer-to-peer learning programs. So a lot of campuses have existing tutoring. We bring them onto our platform, allow them to be accessible at scale. Obviously, online is sort of a key component of that today, but we also support in-person interactions. And so essentially we create high achiever jobs for high achieving students to sign up as peer tutors. Students on the receiving end can then book them for support. The institution wins all around. They create a job for their top students, provide free support for their students on the receiving end, and are able to see uplifts in their largest and most important metrics, such as retention, career readiness, and student engagement. We're based in Tampa, Florida. I know Florida is not the best place to be right now, but we are excited to be building a business here.
Fantastic. I still think Florida is a great place to be, by the way, just not during the virus.
Sure.
Amelia Schaffner, not an unknown face in this community, but please introduce yourself for those who may not recognize you.
Absolutely. I'm going to start a little bit with my background, which is probably less familiar in the system. I come from Accenture, where I spent a lot of my career focusing on strategy, consulting, and innovation. And while there, I really got a passion for looking at future trends, and that's where I got the bug for entrepreneurship and early stage investing. And so I joined Emory Goizueta Business School at the end of 2017 with a very wide mandate to create a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship at the business school. So spend my time with students, alumni, the wider ecosystem, VCs, trying to basically create those opportunities for students to be have a mindset and entrepreneurial opportunities.
Thank you, Amelia. And finally, Colleen Costello, do you mind providing an overview of yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Christy, and good morning, everybody. So I'm Colleen Costello. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Vital VO. We're a New York-based health tech firm focused on protecting as many people and places as possible with our continuous antimicrobial light. I started this company after I had witnessed my grandmother contracting a MRSA infection within a hospital. So I've been focused for the last number of years on developing new tools to address, unfortunately, preventable infections. Obviously, the spotlight right now is on COVID-19 and the germ control related to that, but germ problems have been there before the current pandemic and will be there afterwards. And our technology is really focused on delivering safe and continuous LED light throughout places like hospital settings, food processing facilities, even residential and home applications to allow for a continuous protection around these germ challenges. And we're part of the Engage Ventures group down there in Atlanta and have been engaged in the Atlanta community for over the last year. So look forward to the panel today. Thanks, Christy.
Thanks, Colleen. You're going to learn more than you'd like to from Colleen about germs, and it's really exciting material. So let's get started because I want to keep this information flowing and you guys have an opportunity to really share. A couple of quick notes. We are recording this call for everyone who's on. And then secondly, if you do have questions, there is a chat across the bottom of your screen as a reminder, and I'll try to feed those through to our guests and panelists as quickly as I can. So with that, would love to get started with you, Tom. Just some Q&A around the economy, a very hot topic. When we really look at the stage financial growth that we had out of our last recession, the impact of business, the housing, loss of jobs, is there a comparison we can actually make? Tom? Okay, we may have lost Tom, so I'm going to move actually over to, oh, Tom, are you there?
Yeah, I'm
there
back.
You are. Okay. I love these Zoom calls.
Okay, so yeah, it's a wonderful thing. At least there aren't dogs jumping on me.
Exactly.
Let me spend a couple of minutes talking about kind of the economy and the effect of COVID. The issue here is that we're in an economic disruption that formally counts as a recession, but it's not like any recession that we've had before. And we want to be really clear about that in most recessions, the issue is that there's a policy mistake or some kind of economic shock or some imbalance in the economy. And people get worried about their income streams going forward, and so they cut back on consumption, incomes decline, and the challenge is trying to generate new economic activity to get people back into offices, back into stores, back into restaurants. That wasn't the problem here at all. The problem was that we had this public health problem that physically required people to not go into their offices, stores, restaurants, whatever. We were in an economy that was extremely strong. In fact, we might argue just a booming economy. When out of nowhere, well, not out of nowhere, but when this virus emerged and kind of shut things down. So the issue now really is not so much an economic one, although there are serious economic implications from this. It remains a public health problem that until the public health problem gets solved kind of from an economic policy perspective, things are problematic. That in most cases of a natural disaster, for example, something happens and it's either very short term or maybe a week or so, and then the issue is, well, how do you start the recovery process? Or during a recession, once kind of the smoke clears and we understand what the weaknesses in the economy are, the issue is how you bring about help to bring the economy back to something closer to full employment. That's not the issue right now. That as Fed Chair Powell said, we have the tools to stimulate the economy and bring things back. That's not the problem. The problem is that we have this public health problem that has not yet been solved. And until that really happens, we're in trouble. And, you know, the fact is that when you think about the relief efforts that have been made so far, lending programs from the Fed or grant programs for the federal government, in many ways, what they're doing is providing bridge financing. But the problem is we don't know what we're bridging to. If we knew that this was all going to end in a year, well, providing two-year bridge loans is a fairly straightforward process and not very complicated. But we don't know that that's what the issue is. We don't know how long this stuff is going to go on, and we don't know what the path of the pandemic is going to be in terms of its economic impact. And so as a consequence of that, designing relief, you know, when the problem is not really well defined and certainly not resolved, is a problem. Now, unfortunately, the problem seems to have gotten worse over the last few weeks. We kind of thought that the worst of the infections were over. Kind of consensus forecast for the second quarter was that on an annual basis, we'd lose about a third of GDP, which was an enormous negative shock. But then we would start seeing some positive numbers in the third quarter as the economy started to recover from an unprecedented shock. Unfortunately, now that's kind of in question. Not that we, you know, are in terrible shape, but you know, we have some fundamental questions in terms of the uncertainties the pandemic's taken. At a local level, Georgia seems to have fared a little bit better than the nation overall. That when we look at the spike in unemployment, again, to an unprecedented level, almost 20%, Georgia spiked up in March and April, but not by as much as the nation overall. And then as things kind of, you know, the economy sort of overshot in terms of its layoffs and repositioning its labor force and started to recover fairly rapidly the next month, Georgia did better than the nation as a whole in terms of recovery. Not that we're out of the woods in any sense. Currently, our unemployment rate's about 9.5% in the state. That actually is below the peak of the last recession. So while the kind of fundamental mechanics are very different, to some extent, we're not on wholly unfamiliar ground in terms of kind of social problems associated with job loss. At a national level, we're still way above where we were at a peak in terms of unemployment. And that's going to remain a problem for some time. When we look at kind of the high frequency data, job losses, you know, they are slowing, to be sure, and hiring seems to be very robust. And one of the ironies here is that when you look at things like the number of job openings in the state, and for that matter, the nation too, they really didn't fall off very much. A lot of people who had jobs where the employers, you know, had the positions filled decided that they didn't need them. But the positions that were advertised as being open, and by and large, did not disappear. I think that reflects kind of the odd situation that we were in going into this of an extremely robust economic expansion where a major issue was trying to acquire appropriate talent. And that desire to acquire appropriate talent hasn't mitigated very much at all. So we're in a period of really profound uncertainty. We think that Georgia is a little bit better poised than some other states in terms of our progress in economic recovery. But again, things are very deeply uncertain. And kind of we're going to have to keep a close eye on how the pandemic progresses before we have kind of a better idea of how the economic recovery is going to progress.
Great, thank you, Tom. That's a great overview, and I appreciate you taking the lens towards the local community as well, which is at top of all of our minds. Let's just shift gears a bit, because when we talk about things that are emerging, there's been some key industries that have really stepped forward, and educational technology has been one of those. So I'd love to speak to Samyr just briefly and understand, tell us how Knack has addressed the edutech challenges that universities have seen, and how you've embraced that to really become an emerging startup going from 0 to 100 overnight, literally. We'd love to hear from that, hear your perspective on that.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks, Christy. So, I think education, especially right now, is sort of at a interesting juncture in terms of having a bit of an existential crisis of what is the role of higher ed if the student engagement component is sort of diminished, right? I think when you really strip away athletics, sports, auxiliary services, events, hospitality, student life, all those things, the core sort of skeleton of a campus is teaching and learning. So, whether that's virtual, whether that's in person, that is sort of the original ethos of a university, is to allow that forum for learning and development. I think we're really lucky that we decided to build a product that is sort of an essential component of teaching and learning, which is tutoring, right? Individualized learning is very difficult to scale, especially as you think about large student to faculty ratios. You've got campuses like UGA and University of Florida, where you've got hundreds, sometimes thousands of students to maybe 1 or 2 faculty members. And I think that is all sort of becoming more apparent, that right now, while you've got a focus on sort of survival in higher ed, there is a need to embrace technology to ensure that there can be continuity, but not just continuity, there can be innovation. And I think what we've seen in higher ed especially, and it's not a finger-pointing match at higher ed specifically, there are large bureaucratic organization, oftentimes government oriented. And so when you think about, large, slow moving bodies with thousands of employees or faculty members or staff members, it's really hard to mobilize that change. But actually, we've seen an incredible amount of urgency and movement in higher ed to go from, okay, a pandemic has hit, how do we ensure students can continue to learn? So they did a really, really great job shifting immediately. Now it's sort of, as the dust has settled, everything is online, but that student engagement component, the student life component, some of the other revenue generators, think about sports, alumni engagement, some of those components are really diminished. And so universities are at a really interesting point where they have to kind of reinvent themselves a little bit. And there's always been this focus on, there's a gap of sort of what employers are looking for in the market. I think it's something like 90 to 95% of chief academic officers believe students are prepared and ready to enter the workforce. Whereas when you interview business leaders, I think it's like 10 to 20% believe that. So there's obviously a mismatch. And I think now is actually the perfect moment to reel that in, center back on the customer. I know customer is sometimes a scary word in higher ed, but really students are the payer. And so at this point, I think there's a huge opportunity for higher ed to reel students in. And we've seen some of our partners run very basic surveys of students to say, what's top of mind for you right now? Beyond academics, what's important in life? What would you like to see as an ROI if you're going to continue to invest in education? So I think there's a really opportunistic moment here to get back to that ROI focused thinking from a university standpoint, looking at a student as a customer, but then also ensuring that technology is really a big piece of that portfolio going forward, right? If it's a pandemic today, being in Florida, it could be a hurricane tomorrow, right? And so continuity is really important. So being able to switch between online modalities to in-person and rethinking these models, I think is really, is at this moment today. So I'll leave it at that. I don't know if you have any other follow-up questions, but I do think technology is sometimes a scary word for a lot of folks when they think about automation and replacing, bodies on a campus. But at the end of the day, it should be more about, are we serving the student or are we serving ourselves? And I like to think higher ed is always thinking about serving students. Most all are nonprofits. And so I think when they think about it from how can we maximize impact at scale, the only way to really do that is technology. I think you're muted, Christy.
Sorry, I thought I had depressed the button. Sorry. I would love for Amelia to really highlight the Emory University challenges and even opportunities. Amelia, you're part of Emory's Goizueta Business School, and it's super exciting, some of the decision making that you guys have had in your areas of learning. Can you really talk to the new normal for Goizueta and as we approach fall 2020 and what the innovation and strategies look like as a part of or embracing of educational technologies like Knack?
So I think, like you mentioned, and thank you for that, to put us in context, you know, we have the business school and then there's the wider Emory University, which provides sort of like the general guidelines for us. They're working very closely with all the public health organizations, the CDC, you know, the Georgia Department of Public Health, and even our own rolling schools and all of that. So that has been sort of worked as the general guidelines of how can we be safe, because essentially there are two goals that we're trying to achieve as we go into the fall of 2020. We're trying to achieve, obviously, the continued sharing and learning and education, the providing of knowledge to our students, but also we've heard it like loud and clear from our students, you know, that they want a sense of community. So we're working very closely to focus on those two big priorities. We have teams that are focused on the technology side. So we have an immediate horizon, obviously, which is shifting into how we're going to make a more nimble classroom, you know, make wider space, the 6 feet between, all those sort of like physical impediments that will help us keep safer, but also how do we keep the students engaged? So we're moving to a more hybrid model at the business school. We will obviously curricularly, we will focus as much as we can to be close to the students, keeping both faculty and the students safe, and versus, you know, with the more extracurricular activities, we're going to try to move as much as we can sort of offline and whatnot. We're looking also at the future, you know, as we work on the immediate needs, we're also trying to think about, you know, what's next in the future, what kind of, you know, pedagogy advancements might be available for the future. I mean, there are things out there that we had already been looking at even before COVID hit. You know, you're talking about, you know, holograms, AR, VR, things that are, as Samyr was saying, you know, there's a lot of technology out there, but also we're trying to think like technology is really a tool for us. So our goals currently are really to focus on skilling those students, bringing them back in the, you know, workplace much more equipped. So also taking a look at what also Samyr was saying, you know, what does a corporate workplace want? What does a marketplace look for? They're looking for a, you know, more critically aware student. And so for us to provide those experiential opportunities for the students, that's what we're spending a lot of time on, bringing them outside of the walls of the campus to work with startups, to work with all the organizations that are out there in the ecosystem, so they're not just learning, you know, from the books. And so really spending time understanding what their workplace will needs from these students. And there are a lot of things that, you know, we're trying to put in place. Obviously, currently there are things like whiteboarding. We do a more Socratic method. It's not just, you know, a platform faculty teaching from the podium. We're really trying to create that collaboration, that engagement with students that happens during the classroom. So in a synchronous way and after or beyond the classroom in a more asynchronous format. So lots of technology, but also lots of methods and ways to really engage the students.
Thank you for that. I know that Emory's been really leading a charge and lots of decisions being made there. So I appreciate you sharing on behalf of Goizueta. Let's flip to Colleen, because we love talking about germs. And I think you had such a great share last week, both the story of your grandmother, but I think what struck me was how relevant you have studied germs. So I'd love to talk a bit about Vital VO and your start with that and your obsession around sanitation technology and the approach, and what made you really start kind of thinking about it, and talk to us a bit about Vital VO.
you, Christy. So as I was mentioning earlier, I really became, once I looked at the infection issue and I had experienced going into a hospital to pick up my grandmother, she was supposed to be there one day and they said you have to mask up and wear a gown and she's going to be here for the foreseeable future because she's contracted an infection. I really became obsessed using my engineering background to understand why these infections are happening and why is there something that could be preventable within these healthcare settings that people walk into a hospital and end up worse off than they did when they walked in, unfortunately. And once I started to delve into this problem in more detail, I really couldn't look away in terms of the challenges, both from a human cost and an economic cost that these microscopic germs are causing throughout our society. And really what I learned was the problem was much more expansive outside of just what's called hospital-acquired infections. We're looking at now community-acquired infections, which again, it puts a spotlight obviously right now on the current pandemic, but this is something that we've been focused on for a long period of time. And unfortunately, the tools that we have today to really clean indoor environments have been relatively limited to date. That's what we were really focused on. How do we actually address the continual buildup of germs within indoor environments? You know, as a society, we've all primarily moved indoors, which historically was not necessarily the case. And now we have these built environments that are really a hotbed essentially for germs to grow and thrive and then ultimately have some sort of transmission event where someone ends up sick. It could be something as simple as a common cold all the way to a deadly infection, unfortunately. And historically, the way that we're cleaning these spaces is ultimately wiping and washing is the most common way, you know, even down to hospital settings, which you would think might have some of the best cleaning techniques. What I learned was really they're looking at wiping and washing surfaces maybe once, twice a day. And unfortunately, this leaves huge gaps of time in which these germs can live in those environments and then ultimately transmit. So we really felt as a team that we needed to do something about this and engineer new tools in order to address this challenge. So we set out to essentially develop and have now commercialized and offered to a variety of industries LED technology that can uniquely target molecules that are only in certain germs that are not in human cells, which essentially allow us to use the technology continuously around people by delivering a high quality white light. So if you think about an emergency room, we would replace the standard overhead lighting and have a continuous antimicrobial tool within that environment. Primarily, we're really focused on the germs that live and thrive in these environments, which are bacteria, mold, yeast, fungi. Unfortunately, respiratory viruses create a whole nother host of challenges, as we're all well aware now. And it's not necessarily sufficient to kill the virus. We all have lots of things in our home, typically, that can kill the virus, particularly this SARS-CoV-2, which may be soap or bleach or other elements. But ultimately, right now, as a society, we are focused on stopping the transmission, because how close contact these respiratory viruses can be, it can be a significant challenge to not just kill the virus, but make sure it doesn't get between people's respiratory systems. And that's why obviously all the CDC guidelines are geared towards these social mitigation techniques, as opposed to maybe tools and technologies that are focused on the built environment. We've also been finding over the last 4 months, I mean, our company has had about a 4,000% increase in demand in terms of the work that we're doing in the antimicrobial space. And again, truly social mitigation and ultimately a vaccine are the answers for these types of respiratory viruses. But nonetheless, for example, in a study we just did of over 1,000 Americans, 82% of people are more aware or concerned about cleaning in public spaces. 76% of people are holding brands accountable for how they clean their spaces. And over half of people, so the majority of people, will stop doing business with brands that don't openly discuss their cleaning protocols. So all of a sudden, everything from airplanes to cruise ships to airports to schools to offices, we're now working with on how can they communicate to their constituents a cleaner and healthier environment and make sure that we're all focused on these germ challenges now that it's obviously at a global level incredibly apparent how dangerous and challenging these germs can be. And so that's really what we're focused on over time and will continue to be during this pandemic and also afterwards, to continue to hopefully have a healthier and cleaner world and limit the scope and dangers of some of these germ challenges that are, you know, only getting worse moving forward. And we see the importance of tools and technologies to help mitigate some of these issues.
Fantastic. Can you also tell us some of the places other than planes, trains, and automobiles that you may be working that are interesting to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are working across so many different places you can put an LED. Essentially, an LED is kind of smaller than a thumbnail. If you think of those kind of LED indicator lights, that's the same thing that's proprietary to what we do. So it's not just these industrial environments. We can also embed behind elevator buttons, for example. We've worked with Delta Airlines on their 757 fleet for cleaner and healthier lavatories. Duke University's athletic facilities are protected with our technology. So really limitless applications for where you can put an LED. We also work on solving simpler problems like just killing mold and mildew in your shower with residential products that are available on e-commerce. So really limitless in terms of where we can use our LEDs, and we only continue to expand those applications, either really significant problems or even just smaller consumer residential problems.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Flipping over back to you, Tom, because we've just heard from two very unique emerging technology companies in the crisis. And so I'd love to hear from you. For us, what high growth sectors do you see commonly over the next 5 years or beyond?
I think the key here is over the next 5 years and beyond. That one of the kind of problems, as I said, with the pandemic stuff is that, we really don't know what's going to happen over the next year or so in terms of coping with the pandemic. And so the kind of odd situation now for doing economic forecasts or outlooks is that we actually have more certainty over the longer run than we do over the short run. And I think the way to think about what the pandemic has done is it's really accelerated a lot of trends that we were thinking about doing already. I mean, clearly stuff like what Colleen is dealing with are kind of new and huge demand. Obviously, a 4,000% increase in demand is pretty notable. But the fact is that kind of issues related to hygiene and how we deal with that are things that we probably should have been thinking about for a long time. I know Bill Gates was on this probably a decade ago. But in general, what's happening is that things that we thought were going to happen eventually are kind of happening much more rapidly now. We all knew that we were going to move to a more remote work environment. That has certainly been aggressively accelerated now. The importance of logistics, the importance of distribution channels, are much more apparent now than it's been in the past, although Atlanta has certainly led the way in terms of logistics technology and benefited dramatically from that. Kind of the issue of onshoring of manufacturing and kind of rethinking supply chains generally. Manufacturing and supply chains often a decade ago were thought of as sort of independent things that you went around to try and find where was the cheapest place to make something, and then you had to figure out how to get it from there to here. That's not the way you think about it anymore. We now think about it as an integrated process. And so, the onshoring of things that are high value added, relatively low labor input are, things that were probably going to happen anyway, but it's much more accelerated now. And so what you see again is this, not anything wildly surprising, but just all the stuff that you thought was going to happen eventually is happening a lot faster than we thought it was before. And again, because we went into this with a relatively strong economy, there's a lot of capital out there that's sitting around looking for nice places to seek return. And particularly the investors that are looking for longer run plays, I think are out in force looking for new things to invest in. In terms of office or commercial real estate, it's clear single family sales, last month were near record highs forever. That people are eagerly moving out of multifamily. The people that were thinking about it, obviously had to be thinking about it for a while. This is something that pulls the trigger. office space is going to change. Kind of the per capita space allocations will be different than it's been in the past. Less office occupancy, but more space per person. And in terms of logistics and manufacturing, boy, space demands are very hot right now, particularly around here. This is something that's going pretty strong. So I think, longer term, we're in actually pretty decent shape, and we can kind of see where we're going to be. It's the rockiness in the short to medium term that is really the problem for us going forward.
That makes sense. Thank you, Tom. And just a reminder to the audience that you can ask questions across the chat screen. If there's anything you would like to insert into the conversation, we'd love it to be meaningful for you as well. Just flipping over to Samyr again with Knack. When we think about education, let's say over the past 15 years, and that it's been evolving and it's been changing, it's much of the reason you founded and created Knack. Do you think that, universities, primary schools have really been challenged to meet the demand? If so, I would ask how, and then what do you see kind of future state from that perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think they've been challenged. I think they're sort of additionally challenged during this time. And, I think Amelia echoed some of the sort of trends we're seeing in the market and some of the conversations as we have with campus leaders. I think, again, going back to this disconnect between maybe what the corporate world is looking for in a hire and what the university ecosystem is able to sort of prepare students for, there's sort of this idea that there is some sort of skills gap, which I don't doubt. I do believe there is a skills gap. I also think there's sort of a communication or an awareness gap where students don't necessarily have tangible mechanisms to demonstrate their skills in a way that is absorbable by an employer, right? So in sort of layman's terms, what this comes down to is credentialing. So a lot of folks sort of rely on LinkedIn or handshake profiles and things like that. And those are all great. But I think the more there can be communication between employers and institutions directly on experiences or involvement or activities students are having. For example, if I was at Emory and I was in Amelia's program and I had launched a venture, which we came out of the University of Florida's program, if there was a way, and let's say that venture was sort of a side hustle and I was hoping to then parlay that into the workplace at a Fortune 500, the ability for me to communicate that experience and also be able to demonstrate that it's meaningful and there were skills that were developed or validated behind that is where I think there's an opportunity to really kind of clear up any sort of disconnect between employers and schools. There's a lot happening in this space with credentialing and micro-credentials, and Coursera is doing a lot, partnering with institutions like University of North Texas to do some really interesting work around this. And so I think that's one piece of the pie. I think the other thing is that, again, the institutions have not necessarily had an incentive to reinvent themselves or to be customer-centric in the past, right? And again, it's not a finger-pointing match at higher ed. It's just that when you've got such a legacy sort of operation that's been in motion for sometimes hundreds of years, it's really difficult to break some of those thinking patterns. But now you're sort of faced with, well, students don't have to go to university to necessarily get a job. In fact, some employers are actually recruiting directly from high school. We're seeing sort of these flips in the model where instead of going to school to get a job, you go to a job to then be able to go to school. And what I mean by that is employers are literally allowing students to start apprenticeships or externships without even having a college degree, and then giving them the flexibility to earn a college degree while they're in the workplace. Providers like Guild Education, they're a massive company now that is partnering with employers like Disney and others to really allow education as a benefit. And so you're really starting to see these flips in the model. And I think traditional higher ed institutions have a really hard time adapting to that because they haven't been at the forefront of leveraging technology and innovating. They've sort of been on that traditional model of higher ed, which I think is fine. I think some students still want that experience, but I think over time, the vast majority are going to be needing to address sort of the market concerns around the traditional models that have been in motion. So I think they've been challenged. I think some institutions are meeting that demand, or at least they're making strong attempts to doing so. I think others are not. And so I think it's a very messy problem. It's not a very simple solution. And I think credentialing is a piece of it. I think deeper connections between employers and universities are a big component of that. Entrepreneurship programs are oftentimes the node to bring in corporations into the institution, and I love that. With Knack, what we've done as an example to really try to kind of get ahead of this is we've actually allowed employers to come in and back tutoring sessions or back specific tutors. So they'll sponsor tutoring sessions. Florida Power and Light, large utility company here in Florida, is now covering the cost of tutoring at Florida A&M, a top HBCU. That is essentially allowing them to build brand awareness with this group of students where they've historically struggled, and also to get ahead and find talent in a unique way, which is, hey, we'll put money behind this tutoring program, which recruits high achieving students to become tutors. They're vetted students by the campus and by Knack. They now wear Florida Power and Light's logo. And when a student needs help in let's say calculus, and they go to book that tutor, they see Florida Power and Light's logo on that, and they don't have to pay anything, nor does the institution. The employer is actually paying for it, which is a sort of being written off as a corporate social responsibility foundation sort of development initiative to the university, but is again creating a job for a high achiever that they can keep an eye on and potentially hire for a full-time role or an internship, providing free support for that student on the receiving end, and deepening the connections between that corporation and the institution as a whole. So we've really tried to get ahead of that and allow institutions opportunities to engage corporate partners into the process of student learning and student success as a whole. And I really do believe that is the future.
Thank you for that, Samyr. And Peyton, I see that you have a question. And so what I'd like to do before we respond to that, because I think this is going to involve Amelia and Tom, is ask Amelia a question and then talk about the space that universities actually occupy. But we'll get to your question in just a moment. So Amelia, for you, when we really think about the catalyst of innovation in Emory University and Goizueta as a whole, can you talk to us about the innovation and the cross-disciplinary efforts being focused on innovation and strategy within the university as we think about examples of highlighting those in higher ed in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know Samyr had talked a little bit about how we universities are looking to focus more specifically on the marketplace, on the workplace. Exactly. We've been doing that for a few years now. We have a lot of our programs and end up being focused on experiential learning. So we're trying to bring in the outside world even into the classroom. So there's a lot of programming that even in the curricular space becomes more extracurricular. So an example is our entrepreneurship practicum class brings in startups working directly during the whole entire course with the students so that they can follow the journey of the startup and actually learn from real examples in the classroom. And then we do the same thing also with investors. So we bring investors, for example, to the classroom so that the students are actually learning and apprenticing directly with these VCs on how do you screen startups. And so depending on where their career paths are, we're trying to bring in those aspirations into the classroom and into the side of the classroom, right? So another one of our programs brings together startups and investors, and we have students heavily involved in that process, you know, into interviewing the startups in the ecosystem and so forth. And that's just an example at the business school. Like you were asking the question about multidisciplinary, that's another area that we're spending a lot of time on. So we're not just working in one college by itself. Some of our programs involve working with the law school and with other groups so that students are getting those real life skill sets. For example, that our business school students are learning about IP, copyright, learning about those actual real life scenarios and learning them in a co-curricular setup and scenario. Another example is of what we're doing working with large corporations. Our students, many of them want to follow the pathway of going into consulting, for example, right? So we're bringing large corporations, many of the ones that names you're familiar here in town, to the classroom for like 6-month-long projects where students are actually doing real consulting work. So that's becoming more and more the aspect of how we're teaching students skill sets that they can actually translate and communicate once they go into that real world experience and become more credentialed, to use Samyr's terminology. So those are some examples of how we're switching that more real life scenario, bringing to the classroom.
which ties in very much to what Samyr was commenting on earlier. I'd like to address this question before we move to Colleen, because it's interesting, and I think Samyr, Tom, and Amelia will have kind of varying answers on this. But Samyr, it was addressed to you from Peyton. What do you see happening with real estate around college towns and campuses? Will students continue to be physically in the town of their learning? And what timeline do you see for that? So a couple of predictions and forecasts here, Tom, to play into your space question, but also what are we going to do about the space? Samyr, do you want to go first? Or Tom? Sorry.
Go ahead, Samyr.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, it's interesting. We're seeing, so real estate, for a lot of institutions, and Amelia may have some thoughts on this, is oftentimes a problem in that sometimes they don't have enough space in a traditional, call it pre-COVID world, to be able to have students sort of engage in all different areas. And so a lot of campuses have massive capital campaigns to build new space. And now obviously we're talking about a shifted model. And so, we've heard about that. We've also heard about the opposite. You've got dedicated classrooms that get swelled up, but then you've also got sort of ancillary auxiliary space that isn't getting used. So how can you flexibly take advantage of that? So I think what's going to happen is maybe from a CFO standpoint, they're going to be looking at where is the sort of the saturation and utilization on a campus and where isn't there, and how can we flexibly revamp spaces versus going out on a capital campaign to raise $50 to $100 million for a new building entirely. We're seeing, there's a few friends of mine that are launching a venture where they're actually striking partnerships with public-private entities that work with universities to build out student living. And then basically at the bottom floor, they're talking about having student ventures housed there. So University of Florida does this called Infinity Hall, and they've actually got a whole maker lab at the bottom. They've got, a fab lab, they've got a prototyping lab, engineering, all at the bottom of a student, sort of living complex. And so you're starting to see some more of that flexible incorporating what Amelia is saying, where companies can come in, sponsor the space, allow them to sort of engage with students more directly, more so than I think a traditional classroom being built, right? Because now we're talking about completely shifting the way campuses are thinking about having in-person options in the fall. For example, we work at the University of Akron, and they're saying we're only going to allow students, to be on campus a couple of days a week. And so that empty space is now sitting empty. So again, I think if there's an opportunity to bring in corporate sponsors to repurpose that space in a safe manner, right? I think there's a huge opportunity there. Amelia, I know you're nodding your head. You may have some thoughts around this. I love your background from Accenture, and I'm sure you're able to bring sort of that flair to this world as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's becoming more of a blending, right? Universities are not just the academic campus living by itself. We're starting to see them really engage and get out of their walls and get more into the ecosystem. So there's universities are buying spaces and hubs and, trying to create parks sort of that are focused on specific interest area that they're focused on. I know, of course, for Emory, a big part of that is our focus on healthcare. We launched the Healthcare Innovation Hub as an example. And the work that we're doing is in direct communication and collaboration with corporations. So we're listening what their problems are so that they can reverse pitch them to us, and we can work in collaboration with them. And that's going to require some physical space for us in the future to be able to put all these organizations in one place, working with students, working with faculty, and working with our skill sets and doing the research that needs to be done, that is that sort of cross expertise that's coming from. So corporations have interest in getting the research from universities. Universities have interest in placing, obviously, their students in corporations. So I think we're going to see more of that overlap in the future, and that's going to require some physical collaboration. But I'll let Tom chime in because probably Tom has some perspective to that.
Well, yeah, thanks. I agree with everything that Amelia and Samyr said, and I would frame it in terms of kind of the social aspect of the university experience. That it's more than just being in the classroom and figuring out how to do arithmetic. A lot of what happens you know, what we've been talking about to this point are sort of accidental collisions that result in innovation and, you know, kind of new ideas coming up. But the whole kind of idea of socialization and what happens at a university is something that differs by universities. I mean, I know the Chronicle of Education has been kind of asking, you know, what is Harvard without actually being on campus? Because the point of being on campus in some of these universities is not so much the classroom experience, it's the out of classroom experience. And that's something that I think more and more universities are you know, kind of figuring out, the idea of putting innovation labs on ground floors of student housing is critical for facilitating interactions. And that's kind of what you're there for, just in the same way that, you know, coffee houses in the 60s used to be, you know, an important place for, you know, aspiring writers to interact with one another. It's the same thing. It's just, you know, being mindful and deliberate in constructing space to kind of facilitate the interactions that you want outside of the classroom.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and kind of taking a kind of an investor position on this. And Colleen, I think it'd be interesting to hear the Engage model. What you're really speaking about is kind of a formula for accelerators and incubators hosting students with entrepreneurial mindsets. And I think, Colleen, you probably have some comments to make there, but Amelia, going back to what Emory, or particularly Goizueta's business school has been, is to bring that inside, you know, kind of insight into the university, utilizing that expertise and building that formula for success, so it does stay resident on ground. So I'd love for you two to kind of discuss that. And Colleen, you have a slightly different experience because Engage obviously has the corporate manifestation there, and so I think that would be an interesting conversation quickly, just to take a sideline a bit.
Sure, absolutely. And actually someone who I think was maybe a product of some of that on universities as well. I started the company at RPI here in New York when I was a senior in college, and part of the entrepreneurship program there actually that was blending our engineering department as well as entrepreneurship. And a key element of that was some of the foundry programs they had for different students starting companies, and really that learning experience when ultimately that ideation and early stage of development is somewhat similar across the board. And so being able to have that cross-pollination between student entrepreneurship was a big part of us starting the company as engineering students at RPI. So know it well and see it as a critical element of some of that student entrepreneurship. And, you know, fast forward to now, you know, we're a commercially developed organization, and we worked with Engage Ventures last year, and their model has been incredibly helpful to us as it relates to some of our commercial development, which is more around enterprise sales for large corporations, particularly in the Atlanta area. And they really had a fantastic model as it relates to playing kind of quarterback between the corporates as well as the early stage companies, which can sometimes be oil and water as it relates to, you know, how they go about things in terms of what the startup might be looking to accomplish and what the corporate is used to kind of going about their own processes and delivering innovation. And so having some sort of fulcrum in between that allows to break down barriers and to allow for really commitment actually at a senior level of these corporates, and making sure that things are progressing forward and there's accountability on everybody's part. Really, that made a huge difference. I mean, we work with a lot of corporates across the board, but having a party like Engage Ventures there, you know, in Atlanta, that was a lot about physical interaction as well, and being there and being able to interface with these corporates at a high level, and then behind the scenes having that facilitation to allow for innovation. For example, with Delta Airlines, you know, our technology is now on jet for cleaner and healthier planes. Then a lot of that was through obviously the partnership that they have with Engage Ventures and their commitment to innovation, and knowing that they need to have additional spearheads like an Engage Ventures in order to make sure they're at ahead of the curve, and as it relates to innovation and seeking out companies like ourselves, and vice versa, we can have that interaction and success from a commercial perspective. So those types of things are going to continue to be critical, and there's a lot of examples. I think Engage is a perfect one.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think another trend that we're seeing is university is not just that once and done scenario. Once you went to university, you got your graduation and you moved on to the business world. We're working very closely also with alumni, which come in, they come out, so that journey has stretched out. We're providing a variety of different additional opportunities, even for students that have already gone out of our system. So, for example, our accelerator is open to both students, to faculty, to alumni. So there's that cycle becomes much longer and stretched out in time. So it's a great way to keep in touch with the whole community of a university that's not just like the 2 years or the 1 year you're literally on campus.
Great. Any other thoughts there before we move on? Excellent. So just switching over to you, Colleen, just to kind of talk about Vital VO just a bit further. Can you really maybe outline or help us understand why sanitation technology is so sexy to the world right now, and kind of what the future of sanitation looks like as a growth industry?
Yes, absolutely. And it's certainly a hot topic right now, if you will, as it relates to people looking for some beacons of hope around what are tools and technologies that can help address this. And obviously so much is advancing as it relates to therapeutics and vaccines and sort of more of that biotherapy element, which is critical for attacking a certain sector of germs. But ultimately, there's this large, broad umbrella of these pesky, microscopic elements that are germs, and a lot of them behave differently. They behave in ways that are difficult for us to understand. And unfortunately, we are way behind the curve as it relates to addressing these challenges. And, I see, I'm an eternal optimist. I see it as a good thing that the spotlight is on these challenges because, even looking at antibiotic resistant bacteria, the World Health Organization in the fall of last year was citing that these germs, these superbugs are getting worse by the day. We don't have antibiotics to address them. And so I think this spotlight is critical right now in order to seize the moment and to push forward a lot of different sanitization technologies that are going to be helpful to curb these germ challenges in the first place. The best pandemic, right, is something that no one's ever heard of. Is that something that was stopped somewhere in the transmission vector and that never has the opportunity to kind of get on an exponential scale. And that's what we're focused on. And we really see in our space of technology, automated technologies for disinfection and sanitization are going to be standard issue as it relates to public spaces, offices, and even potentially homes in the future. That's ultimately what we're delivering, is something through lighting that all you have to do is flip a light switch, and it's working behind the scenes, constantly making an in-hospital environment for germs. But there's other things like ultraviolet technologies that are very good at remedial. They kind of flash a space and are able to clean that. There's different air ionization technologies, ozone, that can be going on behind the scenes in HVAC systems. And a lot of these things have been available or are advancing rapidly now. And I think it's going to be something that's a multi-layered defense system. There's no silver bullet or technology included for these germ problems. We're going to need multiple layers, both in the built environment, which is what we focus on, as well as sort of these preventative measures, for example, in hospitals, control over antibiotic use. And a lot of these multiple layers are going to be required in order to prevent these things in the future. And, a lot of the corporations and even industries we work within, I can't tell you the price tag they would pay to have prevented something like this happening, right? And unfortunately, it's only after the fact that the vastness, to Tom's point, of the economic issues are front and center for everybody. And that preventative and proactive approach through things like automated technologies we see coming into airports, airplanes, offices, and also are going to be communicated out to the consumer. So I would expect, you're walking into the grocery store, you're seeing it's a different space now than it was a couple of months ago, right? It's what's going to be expected in airports and airplanes moving forward, and almost required for places to survive. But I think it's an exciting and positive time to bring these things to the forefront so that these things can be prevented in the future.
Are there any best of sanitation technologies that you really like right now? Just out of curiosity. I mean, other than what you're doing, are there some really big ones that we should see on the horizon or pay attention to?
I think that there's categories, right? We're in the continuous sort of antimicrobial space where we believe that continually knocking down the germs never give them an opportunity to take hold within a space. So I think continuous is really critical. There's a lot of things, for example, air ionization, where they're impacting the air continuously, which is incredibly helpful for some of these transmissions. And then ultraviolet light, I'm sure that it's a lot being written about ultraviolet light, has its time and place, but can be very effective at quickly bringing down the bioburden. So again, I think it's a Venn diagram, but I would say the categories of kind of continuous and being able to be safe to be used around people and non-chemical are some of the exciting areas to keep an eye on.
Thank you for that. Thank you. When we talk about diagrams, Tom, over to you, because let's talk about these curves in the economy. We hear V, we hear W, we hear everything from A, B, C, D, E. So would love your perspective on how that's evolving and changing, just from your mind's eye view. What do we see? How can we predict, if we can at all? I mean, we're obviously in a healthcare crisis that's a bit unpredictable.
Yeah, the big issue is how the pandemic itself behaves, and that's really what we need to worry about. In terms of kind of V's versus W's or something like that, we went into this with an extremely strong economy. And so, the potential for a kind of V-shaped recovery was huge. But as time goes by, that diminishes. And, more and more the problem is particularly small firms are just saying, we can't keep doing this. We're going to have to, kind of throw in the towel. Part of what I was talking about earlier with things that were accelerating, not all of that is positive. That we know that food and grocery stores are doing extremely well now, but kind of Main Street retail isn't. Kind of the smaller idiosyncratic, vendor on Main Street, unless they have a serious web presence, is going to be in real trouble. And we've known that for a long time, that, the kind of variety and economies of scale that are happening in online retail put a real squeeze on smaller establishments. And that squeeze has been accelerated pretty dramatically by this. And the longer we end up in kind of uncertain areas, the more small firms are going to drop out. And that makes a V-shaped recovery much less likely. And I think now we're starting to see that even in restaurants, that, more and more restaurants, are just, it's very difficult to continue operating in a very constrained environment. And, again, the issue is that you can hold out for a couple of months, but if you don't have any kind of material cash flow, there's a limit to how long that is. And the problem is it's not linear, that it's kind of, as time goes by, the problem gets worse and worse because, the burdens accumulate across a wide spectrum of businesses. So again, kind of the downside here is that V-shaped recoveries, were actually quite feasible early on. And now it's looking less and less like that's going to be the case. Again, kind of the long-term prospects for the economy remain pretty good. That you get economic growth from productivity enhancements and from adding workers, and neither of those two fundamentals have changed. The problem is dislocation in the short and medium run, which is going to be really painful. And so the extent and the chance of sort of a U-shaped recovery or a pretty decent recovery going forward. It still remains pretty good, but it is problematic that, it doesn't look like, particularly smaller firms can just hold on indefinitely. That's just not where we are.
And Tom, one of our attendees actually asked, and I guess we should have kind of catalyzed this in the beginning. Can you explain the difference between V and W and the other recovery curves? What does that mean, and how do we best understand those?
Yeah, so the idea is that in a V-shaped recovery, you have a bottom to the recession and then snap back very quickly in sort of so that overall output or employment, the time series plot would look an awful lot like a V. We got some of that early on, that we had this tremendous dislocation of workers. And then in the last couple of months, we've seen employment rebound fairly aggressively, not to restore where we were before, but it came back fairly smartly. The concern with the W is that we would get a rebound, but then people would, slack off in terms of their kind of vigilance on this, and we'd end up going back into another recession. And that actually kind of looks like what we've got, so that you'd have sort of a dual trough after sort of a false start in between. So you get something that kind of looks W-like. That's possible, certainly, and certainly is very realistic for some states that are getting hit pretty hard right now. But in general, I think it's going to look kind of more like an inverted square root sign, where we see a very sharp decline, a rebound that's pretty significant, but not all the way to where we need to be, and then a slower recovery coming back from that as we gradually adjust to kind of new realities.
Great, thank you for quantifying that a little bit further. I'd love to shift back over into the education space with Samyr first, and then Amelia, you'll probably have some conversation around this as well. With at-home learning or on-premise learning really being more the new norm, and us seeing kind of mixed signals with return to school, Samyr, how do you feel about this being the new norm, and how is Knack really working to address that, or other technologies in the educational technology space?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for those of you that are listening in, and perhaps even some of you here on a call today, you understand that you've now got kids at home. And so if you're working, I can't tell you how many times we're talking to a university administrator and their kid jumps in, and it kind of humanizes things a little bit, but it obviously complicates things a little bit as well. And so when we think about, flexible models, sometimes you even think about adult learners, they've got their kids at home who are needing to be sort of tended to and guided on their own curriculum. And they themselves are trying to stay on top of their schoolwork and potentially even manage a job. So there's a lot that's happening. I think what we're going to continue to see are flexible learning models, which means tools like Knack that enable you to get help from a peer who's taken your course or who's on your campus at the 11th hour in the evening, once you put your kids to bed and you're taking care of your 9 to 5, might be more attractive for institutions to invest in. The flexible sort of meeting students where they are, quote unquote, is really, I think, the key here. Seeing a lot in the homeschooling world as well, to give parents tools to really, again, help guide their own kids at the more sort of K-12 level. One thing we're doing, which is really interesting, is I mentioned some work we're doing with Florida Power and Light. They've doubled down in working with us and actually have now supported K-12 students who have an identified need by socioeconomic status, who, they have an understanding that there are certain populations of students that need tutoring more than others, considering the learning loss of things going completely at home. And so now they're actually underwriting tutoring through Knack. So they're basically taking our college students that are high achieving across the state, from University of Florida, South Florida, Florida A&M, and they're leveraging that network to help high school, middle school, and elementary school students with free tutoring. It's funded by a corporation again, there's some ROI on branding and doing good there, but more so it's a support mechanism to ensure students on the receiving end are getting free support, take that load off of those parents, allow them to kind of focus on their tasks at hand, but still address some of the issues at hand. So I think you're going to start to see foundations, employers, institutions get very creative in the support, wraparound support mechanisms that are needed. I'm sure Amelia has been thinking very creatively about how her curriculum now, if students can't come into a hardware lab and work on something, what does that look like? You know, I've heard of campuses like UF talking about implementing virtual and augmented reality. There's some fun sort of creative thinking that comes with this, but there's a lot of challenges, and access being one of them. Not everyone has access to internet. Not everyone has access to adequate equipment to be able to engage in student services. So these are some of the things that are buzzing in the space right now, and some of the ways we're thinking about helping to address them with some partners.
Great, thanks for that. And then do you feel like self-paced curricula is more the norm now?
I do and I don't. I think students, especially at the younger age, need accountability. And so that was a big reason FPL came to us and said, hey, even if they're not every week tutoring them on content of math, we want there to be some level of accountability, of mentorship or advising. And the more you can do that on a peer-to-peer basis, the more it feels like a classroom, right? Your students are challenging one another, working together flexibly. So I think the self-paced curriculum is obviously the sort of starting point, but I don't think you can hand a student a curriculum and say, go at it. You really do need guides, teachers, professors, advisors to really help pull them along that life cycle. Because if you don't, I think everyone knows that, you know, students now are oftentimes sort of distracted by shiny objects and internet and things like that. And so you really need to make sure that they're on that path to having sort of a focus on not just get them to that curriculum, but get them through that curriculum.
When we're thinking about that, Amelia, and this grand horizon of change, I would love for you to talk to us about what Emory Goizueta Business School is kind of focusing on in particular around the advanced future.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Samyr did touch a lot of the points that we're thinking on. With this crisis comes both challenges and opportunities, I think, right? So some of the challenges we talked about were certainly access. There are some underrepresented students that might need a little bit more additional help, you know, both where they're located, et cetera, what kind of technology they're accessing that might not be even, and that gap might be spreading. And that's from the student perspective. There's also clearly also, you know, faculty and staff perspective. You know, it's harder these days for women and mothers that are spending a lot of time, you know, trying to teach the kids on, you know, while they're trying to do the work. So these are all challenges that we're going to need to cross and try to figure out ways to help those that have harder, you know, hurdles, and, you know, to try to shrink that gap that we've already have been working so hard to shrink over the last years. The opportunities are like, I think are great, because effectively, instead of having just one mode of teaching, which was the classroom, right now we're augmenting this reality for the students. So you will have certainly the classroom, but there's so much more, right? So we're talking about things like reverse classroom, right? So you teach maybe beforehand, you do some asynchronous lectures, et cetera, and then you bring the collaborative element, and then you might come into the classroom for, you know, a demo day, or you might go outside in the community for an event. You might be doing some online learning modules, but also it's also allowing for geographically more dispersed student base. So many of our students are international. Right now, they might be in a completely different country, for example. So we are looking at, when we say working from home, that shift is going from working from anywhere. So that's an interesting opportunity. I've seen a lot about that, and I think that is exciting, because essentially we are not going to be tied anymore to our physical campus location, right? We're going to be stretching beyond that. We're working already more with not just students, but alumni that are based in other geographies. So I think these are exciting, you know, future opportunities that we're actively trying to bring into our community, so that we are becoming even more of a global university. So that's kind of how we're thinking of it. And then, of course, the technology is going to help. So there's whole teams that are looking at how we might be doing that. audio-visual technology is going to be very important. Right now, you know, everybody's using communication platforms like Zoom, etc. But the definition needs to be higher so that students are able to communicate, let's say with faculty one-on-one. We're looking at technology where faculty can single out an individual student and look at them in the eyes at a very high resolution and actually detect their features and expressions and really have that more customized interaction with the individual, not just, you know, a room full of small screens. So these are things that we are already analyzing. We're talking to a number of different companies that are offering these opportunities. How do we enrich that classroom even once we're past this phase? Because that is effectively the future. You're going to be having these walls where the screens are very, very high resolution. The audio is much more, you know, higher definition and so on.
Great, thank you. We're going to stay in the school, the education technology sector just for a moment. We have a question from attendees, and I'm just going to read it. And they're actually, you know, it'd be great for all of us actually to take a moment and think about this one, but double clicking on what the public schooling system might look like. What do you all think about that as well? Would love to hear, what do you think it's going to look like? Because that has been a massive topic, I would say, over the last 5 days, especially as we look towards August and the return to classroom and what that hybrid, if at all, looks like. So perhaps, Tom, it would be great to hear from you, and Colleen, and then we'll move on.
So one of the big issues that the Metro Atlanta Chamber has been taking on is educational reform. We've been doing that for a long time, and it's a familiar topic, and that's unfortunate because it still remains kind of one of the huge barriers to economic mobility in the metro area. Public schools are providing more and more wraparound services, you know, not just kind of basic education, but also, you know, meals, healthcare, counseling, all sorts of things that just aren't available elsewhere to kids. And one of the huge problems that the Atlanta Public Schools, but I think this is, I know the data for Atlanta Public Schools, I suspect it's pervasive throughout the metro area. There are a large number of kids that just can't attend public school remotely. They don't have internet access. They don't have the computers at home. They don't have high-speed internet at home. There are areas in Metro Atlanta that really aren't served by high-speed internet. We think about that typically as more of a rural problem, but there are still pockets in Atlanta that are unserved. And you know, that's an enormous problem. You combine that with food security and problems associated with that in learning. It's very hard to see how for some elements of the public schools, things can look very different in the near term. Just because public schools have in many places gotten away from kind of teaching kids how to read and do arithmetic. Now it is a kind of wraparound social services that, you know, need to be provided in person. You know, one kind of favorite example of mine from pre-COVID days is going to underperforming elementary schools and providing free eye exams, and seeing that, you know, 20 to 30% of the students required glasses. They just had no ability to get them beforehand. And then you immediately get increase in test scores, just because of something that a lot of us kind of take for granted, that, you know, second graders just couldn't read. Not because they couldn't read, but because they couldn't see the page. You know, very basic social needs are being met in to public schools. And so I think, you know, that trend is likely to persist for a while. And, you know, the COVID issues with remote learning and restarting public schools are really problematic in disadvantaged neighborhoods.
I agree, Tom, and we're working with a lot of public school systems right now, and so learning a lot of insight in that process. And ultimately, the public school systems that we've had experience with, you know, they're having to develop a muscle that they perhaps didn't have before, or had in some limited capacity as it relates to how do we now become infection control experts? You know, what are the different types of mitigation techniques and technologies available that are somehow within our budget? And I think we're going to see that it's prevailing today, at least on a more local level than it is obviously at a national and some states state level, because districts are having to make decisions for themselves depending on exactly what their capacity is. And so that muscle is being developed in some cases faster than others, but ultimately it's a real learning curve for these public schools to try to figure out how they're going to address these significant challenges. Ultimately, you know, I think germs have always been a hotbed within the school systems, whether from daycare or public school. We're all, you know, all aware. I know all of our team members that have kids, you know, it's a constant battle with bringing germs home from school. And so it's always been a circulation of kind of germs and illness. And so, some of that is part of the important element of growing your immune system. But at the same time, some of these challenges, again, are well known in terms of having a lot of kids with maybe not the best hygiene practices within indoor spaces. And so I think one of the elements that we're seeing really interesting as well, in addition to these schools looking at technologies like ours, they're going to need to become a lot more data-driven. Then from a health perspective, then again, they may have had that muscle before. There's really interesting things that are relatively simple, like temperature tracking, but that uploads to the cloud so that you can actually look at local as well as county and state levels of knowing immediately when there may be spikes around temperatures and immediately be able to have mitigation techniques that would be required. So simple things like that that don't sound complicated, but that are not in existence today, are requiring these schools to look at a more data-driven approach to health, which again, I think is a good thing. And I think one of the challenges that we're also seeing is some of the burden is falling to teachers, ultimately to address how they are going to adapt their classroom. You know, we have a lot of teachers who reach out to us and just say, hey, I'm looking at these small devices for, you know, air ionization or UV, you know, do you have any recommendations? I'm going to have to buy this for my classroom if I want to be safer, because our school doesn't necessarily have the budget to do so. So, you know, I think supporting teachers in that vein, who are now becoming a second tier of kind of essential workers on the forefront with these types of data-driven solutions, monitoring, as well as whatever technologies are going to be available, I'd say is, again, the Venn diagram of what we're seeing schools adapt to this kind of brave new world. And it's going to probably play out more on a local level, I would say, at this point in time.
Great. Amelia, can we shift to you and your thoughts?
Yeah, I was just triggered by a thought on the internet access and the geography of public education is actually quite interesting. And I think the trend is going to have to go towards decoupling it to specific geographies and sort of widespreading that, you know, sharing that wealth across different subsets of the population. But also an interesting thing that I heard on the radio yesterday was how certain schools are developing these parking lots where there's higher Wi-Fi. You know, we're going to start seeing potentially some interesting innovations in this space. So kids that live in neighborhoods that might not have access to higher Wi-Fi, for example, are going with their parents in the cars doing their work where there is higher Wi-Fi access. So that might, that shift might drive some innovations that are we haven't seen yet. So I'm really curious to see how that shifts, because there are basic needs for the public schools that right now are not being obviously being met. And so we're going to need to give those priority access zones, and maybe it creates, you know, parks and areas where students are able to access that technology.
Samyr, any thoughts from you?
I think folks pretty much covered, my thoughts as well. It's hard because we see the lens of higher education in colleges and universities, but it sort of trickles all the way down to kindergarten. Uh, and so what we're sort of seeing are maybe some of the lack of yield or admissions that are coming in from high school into college, and some students holding off, right? And so some of those, again, threats, I should say, or things that higher ed has to creatively think about. And again, it starts all the way at the bottom to, kids starting in the K-12 system, but then it trickles all the way up to higher ed. So I think we've pretty much covered what I'm seeing here.
Excellent. So for the group, we just have a final few minutes, and I would love just ending thoughts, maybe sticking with you, Samyr, just to kind of close out your business, your forecast, and some of the topics that we've achieved today. Would love to hear your final thoughts as we move towards the end.
So I think the name of the game in today's world is just sort of being ready for anything, right? Being agile, being nimble. As a startup, I think that's always been in our ethos. And I think from the standpoint of larger entities such as colleges and universities, it's getting back to how do we innovate quickly? How do we respond to the market and changes in a way where we can really respond in a way that values safety for students, but also values the mission of the institution, which is likely to perpetuate knowledge exchange and growth. And so it's a tricky time. I think digital tools and technology need to be sort of considered. And I know many institutions are sort of baking this into a new strategic plan for the future to say this is a spend that we have to really consider. It's not optional anymore. And perhaps, while there may be some optimism around this being a temporary sort of issue with this pandemic, again, we have to be ready for what tomorrow may bring. And in Florida, that's been hurricanes and things like that. And so we've watched campuses always have to be agile here. But I think now that's sort of permeating across the world, really around how do we handle crisis? How do we ensure continuity? Not just continuity, but sort of driving the same experience as much as possible. So you're not dealing with students asking for refunds and feeling like it's a diminished experience. So there's a lot to really kind of think about and creatively innovate towards. But, I'm positive about the future and really believe universities and education is here to stay. And if anything, we're going to come out a lot stronger. So thank you.
Thanks for that. Loved having you. And Amelia, let's flip to you. Final thoughts and closing comments.
Well, I think the key word is adaptability. I think one of the things we are going to be working with is that trade-off between perfection, and having everything checked off, which was possibly a mindset of before COVID, where you needed to have all the different checklists in line when you're adapting a technology or you're adapting some type of innovation, versus immediate adaptability. So being okay with a little bit less perfect systems, but that are easier to use and immediately implementable. So that's kind of where we're seeing potentially a little bit of shift, right? So, and that's actually where innovation comes in, I think, because you're quicker, right? You're prototyping different approaches and they don't have to be perfect from go. So we're going to see a lot of quicker, faster, nimbler approaches.
So it was great having you share your thoughts on Emory and Goizueta. Thanks so much for that. And then let's shift to you, Tom, in closing words and thoughts.
I've got to echo what Amelia and Samyr said. We're in a period of profound uncertainty, but it also requires a lot of adaptability and a lot of nimbleness, and that's being forced on us. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That, we are having to cope with ambiguity, and that's hard. On the other hand, there's a lot of opportunity, and the fact that we're forced to do this suggests that we will come out of this with stronger systems, because if nothing else, we just have to do that. So yeah, I think things in the long run look not too bad.
Great. It was magnificent having you and having you speak towards the economy, and appreciate you taking time out. And then finally, Colleen, would love to hear parting words and thoughts to close today.
Sure. Well, I think my fellow panelists covered exactly what I was going to share as it relates to the sort of brave new world that we're in, and adaptability, and I would say open-mindedness to looking at things in a different way across all of these systems and sectors that we've just talked about. The way we were doing a lot of things previously were clearly not working. And I think it's an opportunity not just laser focused on, viral pandemic, but also all of the systems and things that are impacted, that are challenged in our across a variety of systems within our society right now, that come to the forefront when these types of things become a crisis. And so, I think trying to have a new mindset and a new way to look at these challenges is going to, I think, hopefully have us come out in a way that doesn't include some of the old thinking that got us where we are today. So I think the continued adaptability and use of really exciting technologies will chart, I think, a very positive path forward, albeit through the current uncertain time. And I know we're optimistic and looking forward to continuing to hopefully have a cleaner and healthier world in the future. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Great hearing from you, and congrats on the success of Vital VO. You're definitely one to watch. So excited to see where that lands. Thank you all for joining. I know we're at the top of the hour and running just a bit over. So grateful to have you here today. I hope these topics really resonated and were very relevant in your world. And we will see you back here in our next panel that we have. We have a lot on tap throughout the end of the year. So look forward to seeing you there. And thanks for joining. Have a magnificent round of the rest of the week. Be well. Bye-bye.